The 1960s saw a realignment in our perspectives over many significant areas of human life, from race and family relations to how we regard matters of sexuality and spirituality. Depending on who you ask, the 60s could be seen as a time where many old and outdated systems were revitalized by fresh ideas, or it could be interpreted as a phase where so many new ideas got introduced haphazardly that it did irreparable damage to the integrity of Western society. I think the reality is probably somewhere in between, but it goes without saying that this period saw the introduction of many new ways of conceiving how we could relate to existing modes of practice, and the field of psychiatry was no different. Out of the cultural turmoil came a radical new thinker in the form of R.D. Laing, a Scottish psychiatrist who wrote extensively on the subject of mental illness, in books such as The Politics of Experience, and most famously, The Divided Self, that in the spirit of the times questioned the established perspectives that many psychiatrists held towards matters of mind. What made Laing's arguments so compelling is that when he spoke of conditions such as schizophrenia and schizoid personality type, he did so from an existential perspective. His main complaint arose from the view that the diagnostic criteria that psychiatrists relied on created a barrier between himself and the inner lives of the patients he was trying to access. In The Divided Self, he writes, "There is a common illusion that one somehow increases one's understanding of a person if one can translate a personal understanding of him into the impersonal terms of a sequence or system. Unless we realize that a man does not exist without his world, nor can his world exist without him, we are condemned to start our study of schizoid and schizophrenic people with a verbal and conceptual splitting that matches the split up of the totality of the schizoid being in the world." He stated quite poignantly that no one can even begin to reconcile the existential matters that are befalling an individual with psychosis if we only regard their lives as mirrors of academic abstractions. We have to use the diagnostic manual as a guide, but most importantly, the therapist has to learn to empathize with the patient's way of experiencing life at their level. This style of process necessitated a dramatic departure from the ways that psychiatry had been traditionally practiced, as an outgrowth of medicine, and into a more contemplated domain of human science. Laing called this approach existential phenomenology. Through this process, the therapist attempts to characterize the nature of a person's experience of the world and themselves. This also required a new take on what psychotic fantasies represent to the individual, not merely as irrational delusions that we can fit into some diagnostic bracket or other, but to see the fantasy as a living part of the patient, as something that has grown up uniquely from the conditions of their own life history. By addressing such fantasies in this way, we regard the fantasy itself as offering clues as to how it came to be, and perhaps through such an understanding, a potential way out from it. We cannot find a way out of the labyrinth solely through an assessment of the stonework. We must also consider what it is like to be in the labyrinth, and not simply as a remote viewer, observing the individual lost inside it and giving them directions based on our existential viewpoint.